The world we knew is gone. The markets, the trade routes, the economies, each one a casualty of the Great War. In an instant, the intricate systems of global commerce, backed by governments, currency, and industry, crumbled into dust. Pre-war, the world was connected, organized, and structured, but when the bombs fell, so did everything that upheld the economy. The centralized systems that once provided the foundation for trade, wealth, and survival were wiped out, leaving only ruins and the desperate struggle for resources. In the wake of such devastation, a new world emerged, a world where survival was no longer about money or the exchange of goods in standard, regulated markets. With governments and economies in ruins, people were forced to rely on what they could scavenge, barter, and steal. The very notion of a centralized economy became an afterthought, irrelevant in the face of the fight for food, water, and safety. Yet somehow, the wasteland still functions. Communities survive, not through the wealth of governments or corporations, but through adaptation. The wasteland economy is born from the ashes of the old world, built on the basic principles of survival, resourcefulness, and improvised solutions. Trade no longer relies on gold or paper currency, but on barter, makeshift economies, and entrepreneurial spirit. What was once a highly organized global system of finance now looks like a patchwork of trades, favors, and opportunity. The wasteland's economy is built by the people who know how to adapt and thrive in this new, chaotic environment. The barter system, once a primitive method of exchange, becomes the bedrock of economic activity. Traders, scavengers, and entrepreneurs carve out living from the wreckage. But the question remains: how do entire communities survive without structured financial systems? How do people continue to trade, build, and grow in a world that no longer has functioning economies? This video will explore the fascinating evolution of the wasteland economy. From barter systems to makeshift currencies and the rise of new entrepreneurs, we'll take a deep dive into how survivors make do in a world that has no rules except the ones they create for themselves. We'll uncover how communities like the NCR, the Commonwealth, and the Brotherhood of Steel have adapted to life without centralized economic structures. And we'll also examine the individuals, the wasteland entrepreneurs who found new ways to survive and even profit in the harshest of conditions. The Great War shattered much more than just cities and structures. It dismantled the global economy in a way that few could have predicted. What remained was the wreckage of a once thriving world. A land where trade routes, currency systems, and centralized governments no longer existed. In the blink of an eye, global commerce collapsed as mass destruction and radioactive fallout wiped out entire industries, wiped away cities, and broke apart supply chains that once spanned continents. The immediate effects of the war were chaotic, leaving no corner of the earth untouched. Governments and institutions, the backbone of the pre-war world, disintegrated under the weight of nuclear fire. With the collapse of the global economy, societies found themselves without any semblance of a centralized authority to manage trade, wealth, or resource allocation. This left the survivors with only their immediate surroundings, depending on whatever they could scavenge or scrounge from the ruins of the old world. Across what was once the United States, banks crumbled, stock markets were reduced to ash, and any semblance of global trade evaporated. Without governments and organized infrastructure, survival became the primary focus. For many, the immediate aftermath was a free-for-all hoarding, scavenging, and fighting for resources became the norm as the world's economic systems no longer functioned. In addition to the collapse of currency and trade, The infrastructure and industry that once powered economies ground to a halt. With factories destroyed and supply chains severed, goods once easily manufactured and transported became rare and valuable commodities. With most of the pre-war production capabilities rendered useless, shortages in essential goods, food, clean water, medical supplies, and ammunition became the driving forces behind the survival of the wasteland's new inhabitants. In the cities and settlements that remained, the lack of resources forced people to become entirely self-sufficient. Agriculture, though difficult, became the new economic system for some, while others relied on scavenging the old world's remains to find usable technology, weapons, and supplies. As the war's immediate aftermath began to settle into a new reality, survivors adapted to a life that revolved entirely around self-sufficiency and resource management. The traditional economy, based on work, production, and exchange, had been replaced by survivalism. In the absence of centralized trade, people started hoarding supplies, stockpiling whatever they could find, whether it was food, weapons, or materials for crafting. Cities became ghost towns, with only a handful of survivors sifting through the remains of the old world. Those who had access to pre-war caches of supplies or vaults had an advantage. But for the most part, survival was dependent on finding resources on the fly. Trading became informal, at first one person's bottle caps for another's ammunition, medication for food, but these primitive exchanges kept the survivors alive, if only for a time. With every scavenged bottle, scrap of metal, and bit of technology becoming more valuable than it ever had been, survivors soon found that survival itself had become the economy. Alongside the collapse of financial systems, the fall of public institutions like schools, hospitals, and law enforcement meant that communities were left to rely on their own for everything. There were no police forces to maintain order, no emergency services to help the injured, and no government welfare to feed the hungry. It was every person for themselves or the closest community they could band with. In the absence of centralized governments, public health systems ceased to function, leading to diseases and epidemics running rampant in the wasteland. Hospitals became ruins or were repurposed as fortresses, and medical care became a luxury that only the lucky could afford. The common people, fending for themselves, had to figure out how to protect themselves, band together for survival, and rebuild the crumbling infrastructure piece by piece. The period following the collapse was marked by a profound instability. Governments might have collapsed, but in their wake, chaos reigned. Bands of raiders, violent scavengers, and mercenaries roamed the land, pillaging settlements and fighting for control of the most vital resources. The few who managed to establish order created pockets of desperation, where warlords and strongmen ruled through violence and intimidation. Fear ruled the wasteland as much as survival did, and many survivors resorted to stealing, killing, or trading their lives to survive. In this environment, individuals became their own economy. Some survivors took to military-grade technology, scavenging the remains of old military bunkers and vault-tech laboratories for anything that could give them an edge. Others turned to banditry, using violence to acquire what they needed. Those who found sanctuary in the remains of pre-war bunkers or vaults had a greater chance of survival. But these survivors were few and far between. By the time the immediate shock of the war's collapse had settled, self-sufficiency and resourceful survival became the cornerstone of the wasteland's economy. Without formal systems of finance, government, or trade, every interaction was about bartering for what could be scavenged, protecting what little was left, and learning to live with the constant scarcity. For many survivors, resources became the real currency, and with it came the realization that the old world systems were irreparably broken. Survival, once a matter of individual self-interest, gradually evolved into a more complex, localized system of mutual aid. Factions and settlements began to form around what remained groups pooling resources to protect each other and trade for goods and services. People became more self-reliant as centralized financial systems ceased to exist. But new forms of informal economies emerged from the ashes of the old. In the immediate aftermath of the Great War, currency as humanity once knew, it ceased to exist. With the collapse of the financial systems, centralized governments, and the global trade networks, survivors were left to figure out how to meet their most basic needs. Barter became the default economic system in this new, lawless world, where survival wasn't just a matter of having money. It was about having resources and the ability to trade those resources for what you needed to stay alive. In the Wasteland, goods became currency. Food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, and even scrap metal or rare technology were the most valuable items people could trade. In the absence of traditional money, these tangible resources served as the foundation of economic exchanges. For example, a survivor might trade 2 bottles of purified water for a weapon, or bullets. Practicality was the rule. No one was interested in abstract currency. They needed items that could be used immediately or would help them survive the harsh realities of the wasteland. Survival was the driving force behind these transactions. For the most part, barter was based on immediate needs, trading food for shelter, water for medicine, a weapon for protection. People didn't just trade what they had for what they wanted, but for what they needed to keep going. When you're living in a world where death is a constant companion, resources are both the means to survive and the currency you trade to ensure another day. As time went on, survivors realized that trading resources wasn't just about surviving the day. It was about creating a network that could be relied upon over the long term. The traders and merchants who emerged in the wasteland took this idea to heart, setting up informal trading posts and supply routes to connect different settlements, towns, and factions. These merchants, whether working independently or for larger factions, became essential to the wasteland's economy. One of the most notable examples is the Mojave Express, a courier service that became a staple in the Mojave Wasteland, offering goods and services in exchange for bottle caps and delivering critical messages between settlements. Trading caravans like these help spread goods, create connections, and allow survivors to access items that might be otherwise unavailable to them. However, the barter system wasn't without its limitations. While it worked in the short term, as long as resources were scarce and communities were small, it became clear that barter had its constraints. What do you do when the goods you have are difficult to trade? Or when the item someone needs is simply unavailable? The lack of universally accepted value made bartering difficult when 2 parties couldn't agree on what to exchange for a certain good. For example, trading medicine for food could be difficult if the person offering the food didn't need medicine or didn't value it as highly. And, without a universal standard of exchange, certain goods became more valuable than others, making it hard for someone to obtain what they needed if they didn't have something in equal or greater value to offer. Out of this uncertainty, bottle caps emerged as the first form of unofficial currency. Initially, bottle caps were simply a practical item to trade for their inherent value. Used as caps for pre-war bottles, they were easily acquired and held in large quantities. However, survivors soon began to recognize their value as a standard unit of exchange. The NCR, New California Republic, in particular, helped solidify bottle caps as the de facto currency. With their need to stabilize trade in the Mojave and keep order amidst the chaos, the NCR adopted bottle caps as a way to regulate economic exchange across a vast and varied region. Slowly, their use spread across the wasteland, and bottle caps became the standard of exchange in many parts of the post-war world, from the Commonwealth to the Mojave Desert. But why bottle caps? While they were originally just a convenient form of currency, they became entrenched in wasteland culture. Bottle caps were small, durable, and easily carried. But they also had a certain symbolic value in a world that had lost much of its structure. The humble bottle cap represented a semblance of order amidst the chaos. Survivors began to treat caps not just as currency, but as a way to mark the passage of time, and perhaps even a symbol of the past world's legacy. Beyond just physical goods, the wasteland economy began to shift toward bartering for services. In a world devoid of formal institutions, human labor and skills became a highly sought commodity. People would trade their skills, carpentry, scavenging, weapon crafting, medical care in exchange for goods or protection. As settlements grew and factions formed, tradespeople emerged to offer services that were essential to the survival of the community. For instance, medicine became a precious service, with doctors and chemists offering their services in exchange for food, water, or other critical items. Likewise, weapon repair and crafting became a crucial service, especially in the lawless zones where danger lurked around every corner. While barter and bottle caps became the foundation of the wasteland's economy, it was soon evident that the barter system had limitations. There were too many variables, too much uncertainty. In a world where both scarcity and opportunity fluctuated wildly, people began to look for other ways to trade. Barter was still practical for small personal exchanges, but the rise of larger settlements and more organized factions led to a need for a more structured system, where not every transaction could be a direct, one-for-one exchange. This led to the eventual emergence of more formalized makeshift currencies, new business models, and the birth of traders who could facilitate larger exchanges across much wider areas. As settlements like the NCR, the Commonwealth, and the Great Khans grew, their reliance on a more standardized currency like bottle caps allowed their economies to scale, and their trade networks to flourish, even amidst a world that was still heavily fragmented. As the fallout from the Great War settled, humanity adapted, forging an economy born out of necessity. Barter had served as the first lifeline, a way to exchange essential resources like food, water, and weapons. But as time passed and survivors began to settle into new patterns of life, makeshift economies began to emerge, new systems of trade that adapted to the wasteland's harsh realities. One of the most notable shifts in the wasteland's economic landscape was the rise of bottle caps as the first widely accepted form of currency. Originally, they were just a practical means of closing bottles. But in a world where traditional money no longer held value, bottle caps became the currency of choice. The NCR, desperate to stabilize trade and bring order to the Mojave, embraced the use of bottle caps as a de facto standard for commerce. Their acceptance spread quickly, as people found it easier to trade goods with a tangible, consistent currency. In a place where barter had once been king, bottle caps provided a common ground, something that could represent value and make trade more efficient. While bottle caps became widely used in the Mojave, they weren't universally accepted. Other regions and factions had their own local currencies or economic systems. For example, in the Sierra Madre in Nevada, Sierra Madre chips became a valuable currency in that isolated region, favored by the Sierra Madre Casino. These chips, used in gambling and transactions within the casino, became a specialized currency, valuable only within the casino's walls. The wasteland's diverse factions and regions each developed their own systems of resource exchange. While bottle caps were a convenient standardized currency, some settlements and organizations had needs that required more specialized forms of economic exchange. Jet and other chems. In regions like New Reno or the Pit, certain drugs and chemicals became their own form of currency. Jet, for instance, became an unofficial currency in some places due to its addictive nature and high demand, especially among raiders, gangs, and those desperate for power. These drugs and chemicals became so ingrained in these areas that they served as a trade good, a valuable commodity that could be exchanged for food, weapons, and even protection. Scrap and salvage. In regions like the capital Wasteland or the Commonwealth, scrap metal, old technology, and weapons were often bartered or sold. These regions had significant post-apocalyptic scavenging economies, where survivors would spend most of their time scouring the ruins for usable materials. Pre-war tech was a particularly prized commodity. Items such as fusion cores, energy weapons, and computers could be exchanged for food, water, or bottle caps. As cities and factions began to rebuild, this recycled technology became integral to the Wasteland economy, fueling trade in weapon mods or even robotic repair kits. The economy of the Wasteland wasn't just driven by individual bartering and trading. It was shaped and influenced by the larger factions that sought to establish control over resources, power, and wealth. The NCR. The new California Republic sought to create a more regulated economy in the Mojave. While it used bottle caps as the standard currency, it also introduced trade regulations and a tax system. NCR merchants operated under strict guidelines, with tariffs on certain goods and a measure of economic stability. However, their corruption, limited resources, and challenges in maintaining control over vast territories often meant that the NCR could not enforce its laws consistently. Local economies in NCR-controlled territories flourished to some degree. But the chaos outside of NCR jurisdiction often led to instability and economic strain. Caesar's Legion, on the other hand, operated on a system of subjugation and exploitation. Under the leadership of Caesar, the Legion imposed a brutal economy based on slave labor. Slaves were used to cultivate food, manufacture weapons, and build infrastructure for the Legion's expanding empire. The Legion's economic system was marked by militarism and hierarchical control. Every resource and piece of wealth was funneled to Caesar and his generals. For the Legion, economic prosperity meant absolute power, and their control over conquered territories allowed them to exploit local resources, force trade, and ensure their dominion was self-sustaining. The Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel, focused on recovering and hoarding pre-war technology, developed a unique economic model centered on technology control. They didn't trade or barter in the traditional sense they took. The Brotherhood controlled vast amounts of military-grade technology, from power armor to laser rifles, which they used to assert dominance over factions or territories. While they didn't involve themselves in typical market transactions, their technological monopoly meant they had a dominant economic influence on those seeking to buy weapons or defend themselves. Even factions like the NCR often found themselves having to broker deals with the Brotherhood to gain access to pre-war military technology. The rise of new Wasteland entrepreneurs, traders, mercenaries, and scavengers became the lifeblood of the makeshift economy. These traders were the economic connectors between different factions, regions, and people. They braved the Wasteland's dangers to get essential goods to places where resources were scarce. The legendary Mojave Express, for example, wasn't just a courier service. It was a vital part of the economic infrastructure of the Mojave, connecting settlements and allowing for the exchange of goods, messages, and trade. Traders would form caravans, traveling dangerous roads, fighting off raiders, mutants, and death claws to deliver goods and keep the economy alive. Some traders became well known for their reliability and toughness. Mick and Ralph's in New Vegas, for example, was one of the most trusted spots for trading and selling goods. Merchants like these served as intermediaries, ensuring that communities had access to the things they needed, whether that was medicine, weapons, or even luxury items like alcohol and entertainment. In the wake of the Great War and the collapse of the Old World economy, a new class of entrepreneurs began to rise in the Wasteland. These were not the polished corporate executives of the pre-war world. No, they were survivors, scavengers, and opportunists, shaped by the harsh conditions of a world that had lost almost everything. They were the people who adapted, who saw opportunity where others saw only ruin. They built new economic systems from the ground up, creating businesses and industries that catered to the immediate needs of the Wasteland. The Wasteland entrepreneurs became the lifeblood of the new economy, bridging the gap between survival and progress. When everything collapses, people begin to look to what they can control. For many, this meant becoming independent traders, individuals who could supply much-needed resources to isolated communities. Whether they were scavengers or merchants, these entrepreneurs filled the economic gap left by the fall of pre-war trade routes. In the Mojave Wasteland, traders like Mick and Ralph set up shop, not just to sell goods, but to offer services to the survivors who found themselves stranded in one of the most dangerous regions in the post-apocalyptic world. They knew what people needed: food, weapons, and ammunition, and their businesses thrived as a result. But these traders were more than just shopkeepers. They were the middlemen who connected otherwise isolated settlements and individuals, providing a crucial link between the far-flung survivors. These small businesses were critical for the survival of many communities, offering not only traded goods, but also safe havens, places where survivors could gather information, barter for resources, and sometimes even find protection. Many of these traders built loyal customer bases through their reliability and trustworthiness. The Wasteland didn't have major corporations, but it had these small, scrappy businesses, often born out of sheer necessity and survival instincts. Where there's a need, entrepreneurs will find a way. In some parts of the Wasteland, especially in the post-war ruins of major cities, smuggling networks grew out of the need for access to restricted or hard-to-find goods. From rare tech, weapons, and chemicals to luxury items, the Wasteland's underground economy thrived thanks to those willing to take risks and bend the law. Smugglers became an integral part of the Wasteland economy, facilitating the flow of goods that might otherwise be unavailable or highly restricted by factions like the Brotherhood of Steel, the NCR, or Caesar's Legion. These entrepreneurial smugglers found lucrative opportunities in trading black market goods, such as advanced pre-war technology, weapons, and even human trafficking in some cases. For example, Radaway and Jet were sometimes smuggled into high-demand areas to fuel addiction or support drug trade economies. One well-known example of a Wasteland entrepreneur with a smuggling network is the Great Khans, a notorious tribe that specialized in drug manufacturing and trade. They not only manufactured chems, but also used their entrepreneurial networks to trade these illicit goods with other factions, selling jet and other powerful chems to raiders and mercenaries across the Wasteland. Though smuggling was often a dangerous business, it offered those who could succeed in it immense wealth and power. These entrepreneurs didn't just adapt, they took advantage of the lawlessness to build profitable, albeit often illegal, businesses. Another rising force in the post-war economy was the mercenary business. As factions like the NCR and Caesar's Legion vied for control of resources and territory, the need for armed muscle grew. This created opportunities for entrepreneurial mercenaries to turn a profit by offering their services to the highest bidder. Mercenaries often formed small bands of hired guns, taking on dangerous contracts for factions or settlements needing protection. They fought against raiders, super mutants, or death claws, and also provided escort services for traders and caravans crossing dangerous wasteland territory. With the collapse of pre-war military forces, mercenary companies became a necessity for maintaining order or securing the survival of settlements. Some individuals, like the king of Freeside, were able to build empires by organizing groups of mercenaries to protect and control vital areas. While they were often seen as vigilantes or lawless warlords, their services were invaluable to the people of the Wasteland. These entrepreneurs of violence turned military service into a commodity, where the best mercenary outfits could command high fees in exchange for their services. What made the Wasteland entrepreneurs unique was their ability to innovate. When traditional technologies were unavailable, survivors had to rely on whatever they could scavenge. This led to the rise of makeshift technology systems designed to meet immediate needs, but often using recycled or scavenged parts. Some of these innovations became vital components of the Wasteland economy. One of the key industries to emerge from these makeshift economies was the production of automated turrets and robotic repair kits. As people learned to scavenge old-world tech, they began to repurpose pre-war military technology to create things like automated sentries and robotic workers. These gadgets and technologies were sold by entrepreneurial tech scavengers who could find the right parts and knowledge to bring these machines back to life. Robots like Mr. Handy became valuable assets to those who could afford them, offering protection or labor in a world that desperately needed both. Other entrepreneurial innovations included scavenged fuel. As fusion cores became increasingly rare, survivors had to figure out how to produce their own fuel or alternative energy sources to keep their vehicles, machinery, and settlements running. Some traders even began to offer alternative energy solutions, like solar panels made from old-world tech, creating new economic sectors for those able to adapt and innovate. Black markets were vital to the survival of wasteland entrepreneurs. The lawless nature of the post-apocalyptic world meant that many goods could be obtained without the oversight of factions or organized economies. Weapons, high-tech gear, and chemicals were particularly valuable commodities, but so were luxury items like alcohol, perfume, and books. In places like New Vegas, black markets thrived. Where goods were traded without question, contraband items were often sold in back-alley deals, with entrepreneurs profiting from the demand for these illicit goods. As settlements grew and new factions like the NCR attempted to bring order to the Wasteland, black markets offered an alternative to the bureaucracy and regulations of these larger organizations. The freedom to trade what you wanted, when you wanted, allowed entrepreneurs to build wealth and influence. While individual survivors and small groups struggled to rebuild a form of barter and trade, the major factions of the Wasteland also adapted, each with their own economic systems designed to solidify their power and control. The landscape of the Wasteland is not just shaped by the struggles of lone scavengers and entrepreneurs, but also by the economic policies of larger factions, such as the New California Republic, NCR, Caesar's Legion, the Brotherhood of Steel, and the Institute. These factions, each with their own vision for the Wasteland's future, exert considerable influence over trade, resources, and survival in their territories. The New California Republic, NCR, formed from the remnants of pre-war government ideals, represents the most organized and structured economic model in the Wasteland. Although still a relatively young faction, the NCR has made significant strides in bringing a semblance of stability to the Mojave Wasteland. by reintroducing currency, establishing trade routes, and enforcing tax systems. The NCR's currency system is centered around bottle caps, but they also attempt to regulate commerce and taxation. Merchants in NCR-controlled territories are expected to abide by these rules, but the NCR's economy still suffers from severe resource limitations, corruption within their ranks, and inefficiencies in distribution. Despite their progressive stance on rebuilding a more organized economy, the NCR struggles with internal challenges. The enormous cost of maintaining a military presence to protect their settlements, and the constant drain on resources caused by the ongoing conflict with the Legion and other factions. While the NCR's economic model may seem idealistic, it is plagued by bureaucratic hurdles and the fact that much of the Mojave still remains in a state of chaos. As a result, the NCR often has to rely on local entrepreneurs and traders to fill in the gaps of their economic system. Despite the NCR's attempts at regulation, much of the Mojave's economy operates through informal and black market trade. Even NCR-controlled regions rely heavily on smugglers and entrepreneurs to keep trade routes functioning. In stark contrast to the NCR's more regulated approach, Caesar's Legion operates with an entirely different economic philosophy, a system of subjugation and exploitation. Led by Caesar, the Legion's economy is fueled by the forced labor of enslaved populations. These slaves are used to work the land, manufacture weapons, and even serve as fodder in the Legion's military campaigns. The Legion does not rely on currency, but instead, resources and labor are directly controlled by Caesar and his commanders. For Caesar, the economy of the Legion is based on the concept of absolute control of people, territories, and resources. The Legion captures entire settlements, enslaving the population to work for the Legion's cause. The enslaved labor force provides the Legion with a constant supply of food, weapons, and other necessities, all under the strict control of their leaders. This allows Caesar's Legion to maintain a self-sustaining economy, with resources being directed to the military and their ongoing conquests. The Legion's economy is simple power equals wealth, and wealth is measured in territory and people. They do not need currency because their conquered resources are essentially owned by Caesar and distributed as he sees fit. The economic model is harsh and brutal, with slaves being used as economic tools. This leads to a society where only those at the top, Caesar and his generals, hold any real wealth, while the rest of the population is enslaved or forced to survive in poverty. However, despite its savagery, this economy of subjugation provides the Legion with the resources to wage war and expand its influence across the Wasteland. The Brotherhood of Steel represents a faction where the economy is built on a monopoly of technology and military power. Though the Brotherhood isn't interested in traditional economies, such as trade or currency exchange, they maintain economic power by controlling pre-war technology. The Brotherhood holds significant military-grade weaponry and technology that can give them leverage in any settlement they choose to interact with. While the Brotherhood doesn't trade in the same way other factions do, their influence is felt in the economic systems of the Wasteland, because they control critical technologies. The Brotherhood is known for acquiring and hoarding pre-war tech, including power armor, laser weapons, and fusion cores, making them invaluable to anyone who needs military-grade weaponry or defense systems. This technological monopoly means the Brotherhood controls a substantial amount of wealth in the Wasteland. However, their insular nature and disinterest in civilian life mean that they aren't entrepreneurs in the traditional sense. Instead, they prefer to maintain strict control over what they have. While the Brotherhood is seen as a technological elite, Their strict hierarchies and reluctance to share resources make them more of a resource-based power rather than a traditional economic entity. Still, factions like the NCR and independent survivors will often make deals with the Brotherhood, trading valuable goods for access to their technological resources. In a world where most factions are scraping by with scavenged technology, the Institute stands apart as one of the few factions that possess access to advanced, pre-war technology. Hidden beneath the surface of the Commonwealth, the Institute's economy is based on scientific advancement and cutting-edge technologies, including robots, synthetic humans, and energy production that is far beyond the capabilities of most other factions. The Institute's economic power lies in their black market for high-tech goods. While they often deal with other factions, sometimes under the guise of alliances or diplomatic agreements, the Institute's true wealth lies in the technological advancements they have mastered. Their ability to create artificial intelligence, robotic workers, and fusion-powered energy sources places them in a unique position to trade valuable resources with groups that lack such technology. While the Institute doesn't directly engage in the traditional economy like the NCR or Caesar's Legion, their influence is still felt across the Wasteland. Mercenaries and entrepreneurs who can gain access to Institute technology often make enormous profits by selling or using that tech to their advantage. Energy weapons from the Institute are highly sought after by various factions, while the Institute's scientific research holds the key to advancing life in the Wasteland if anyone can gain access to it. The Wasteland's economy, shaped by necessity and survival, has persevered through unimaginable hardships. Yet, as the world continues to evolve, the Wasteland faces new challenges, many of which threaten its fragile economic systems. Resources are dwindling, population numbers are growing, and the political and social landscapes are becoming more complex as new factions rise and vie for dominance. How will the Wasteland economy adapt to these new pressures? One of the greatest challenges facing the Wasteland's economy is the constant scarcity of resources. After the Great War, the world's natural resources were drastically depleted. Water, food, and fuel are the most critical items in the Wasteland, and their availability can determine the fate of entire settlements. For instance, the Mojave is plagued by water shortages, while the capital Wasteland deals with the constant threat of radiation contamination. As resources become more scarce, factions, traders, and survivors will find themselves competing for control over vital supplies. The tension between settlements, caravans, and factions will only increase as rations become more valuable. Water sources, like Lake Mead in the Mojave and the Purifier in the capital Wasteland, are coveted commodities, and control over these resources will drive future conflicts. For the NCR, who is already struggling with the burden of governance and corruption, the depletion of vital resources could lead to internal instability. The New Vegas economy, reliant on trade and casinos, will also suffer if food supplies dwindle or energy becomes harder to come by. Meanwhile, Caesar's Legion, with its brutal control of resources, will continue to exploit those weaker than them to feed their war machine. The Wasteland is teeming with factions, each one vying for control over key resources. Major cities and settlements like the NCR, New Vegas, and the Commonwealth rely heavily on limited resources that often overlap water, electricity, and precious metals for crafting. As these areas grow and population pressures increase, conflict over access to resources will only intensify. Energy, especially fusion power from fusion cores or wind turbines, will be another major point of contention. Communities in the Wasteland will need to find new ways to generate sustainable energy as old sources are depleted. The Institute in the Commonwealth holds the key to advanced energy solutions, but its secretive nature and desire for absolute control means that this technology could be kept from the rest of the wasteland. Rival factions, such as the Brotherhood of Steel and the NCR, may try to seize this power source to maintain their dominance, leading to potential resource wars. With factions growing more powerful and resource scarcity becoming a significant problem, alliances between groups may become more common. Smaller, struggling settlements might need to band together in mutual defense pacts, pooling resources and sharing supplies. This could lead to the emergence of new trade routes and economic hubs that are governed by collective decision-making rather than centralized power. Wasteland traders, once independent, may form networks or guilds, providing vital services to a broader range of settlements. A new economy of trade could emerge, where goods are traded over longer distances between settlements, facilitating cooperation and survival. Caravans could become not just about moving goods, but also about moving information, helping communities to adapt to resource changes and threats in the region. Factions like the NCR, Brotherhood of Steel, and the Institute may see the value in cooperation as long-term sustainability becomes a priority. The rise of trade could lead to new diplomatic relations, where shared resources are exchanged for military protection, technology, or scientific advancements. While this may take time to build, the need for stability will eventually push these groups toward economic cooperation. One of the most exciting prospects for the wasteland economy is the potential role of technology. Although many areas remain technologically backward, certain factions and individuals have access to pre-war technology that could transform the economy. The Institute's advanced technologies, from robots to fusion reactors, represent the future of energy and automation. Automation, including robotic labor, will play a significant role in replacing human labor in areas like manufacturing and construction. Robots may be used for agriculture, manufacturing, and even military defense, allowing settlers to focus on higher-value work or the growth of new industries. The introduction of advanced AI and machine intelligence could also help to streamline resource management, improving efficiency across trade networks, agriculture, and construction. For some, robotic labor could be the key to overcoming the wasteland's resource limitations. However, this kind of technology is rare, expensive, and often monopolized by factions like the Brotherhood of Steel or the Institute, making it available to only a select few. As the wasteland's economy continues to evolve, the ability to use resources efficiently will become critical. Recycling and reusing materials will be essential to survival. The growing demand for scrap metal, fuel, and energy-efficient technology will push survivors to become more resource-conscious. People will be forced to innovate with the limited materials they have, creating new methods of energy production and resource conservation. The NCR may invest in agriculture, utilizing hydroponics or fertilization systems to grow food in the harsh Mojave Desert. Other settlements might begin to focus on wind and solar energy, creating eco-friendly solutions that ensure long-term sustainability. The push for self-sufficiency will result in a growing culture of innovation, where every settlement will need to find ways to adapt to an ever-changing world. In time, new methods of resource management could emerge, creating a more sustainable, if unpredictable, economy that functions despite the wasteland's chaos. The wasteland's economy is a patchwork of resourcefulness, adaptability, and necessity. In a world where the old systems of trade, currency, and governance were obliterated, the survivors didn't simply succumb to chaos. They rebuilt, redefined, and reimagined what it meant to survive economically. From the remnants of destroyed cities and crumbling infrastructures, the wasteland economy has emerged as a complex network of barter, makeshift currency, and thriving entrepreneurial ventures. It is a harsh and unpredictable world, but the resilience of its people has ensured that life persists. The barter system, once considered a primitive form of exchange, laid the foundation for what would become a surprisingly functional economy. As survivors learned to trade the very essentials of life: food, water, weapons, and medical supplies, they began to rebuild their communities. The rise of bottle caps as the standard currency provided stability where there had been none, while entrepreneurs and traders continued to shape the Wasteland's economy, creating networks that bridged isolated pockets of civilization. This new economy wasn't based on traditional finance. It was born from the human drive to survive, to create value from the wreckage of the old world. At the heart of this economy lies a core principle: adaptation. The Wasteland survivors have not just managed to stay alive, they've thrived by finding innovative solutions to every problem that arises. Whether it's smuggling, makeshift manufacturing, or resource-efficient trade, every action in the Wasteland economy is an act of creation. Entrepreneurs rise from the ruins, not just to survive, but to carve out new opportunities where none existed before. Mercenaries, traders, and engineers provide services that didn't even exist in the pre-war world, making the economy more dynamic and diverse than ever before. But it's not just about individual ingenuity. The Wasteland economy is also shaped by the larger forces at play. Factions like the NCR, Caesar's Legion, the Brotherhood of Steel, and the Institute exert significant influence over how resources are distributed, who gets to trade, and what technologies are available. While these factions may control the larger economic systems, the entrepreneurial spirit continues to thrive, often in opposition to or alongside these factions, providing essential goods and services in an economy that is constantly evolving. Looking ahead, the Wasteland will face new challenges. The scarcity of resources will continue to shape the economy, driving conflict and cooperation between factions. As the Wasteland's population grows, competition for water, food, and fuel will increase. But so too will the potential for new economic alliances. Advances in technology and resource efficiency will open up new possibilities, whether through robotic labor, fusion power, or AI advancements. The Wasteland will adapt, as it always has, using creativity and innovation to meet the needs of the survivors. In the end, even though the old world is gone, its governments, economies, and systems of trade crushed by the weight of the war, the economy of the Wasteland endures. It is a living, breathing system, one that grows and evolves with each passing day. What has emerged from the ashes of civilization is a testament to the resilience of humanity. The Wasteland may be broken, but its economy is anything but. It thrives on adaptability, entrepreneurship, and the relentless drive of those who call it home. As long as there are survivors, the Wasteland economy will continue to evolve, finding new ways to survive, trade, and build amidst the ruins.